China is clearly on everyone's mind. And Rauschenberg perhaps less so. It's a strange thing when someone dies. There's always for an artist or a writer, there always seems to be a latency period, or a period of where you don't hear their name so much anymore. You know, they're not producing the work any longer, and there's much less press about them, which is, you think of John Updike, the same thing is happening with him. When was the last time you heard John Updike's name? He's got a book out now, a collection of his journalism, but it happens. And then after a while, people start picking up the pieces again and start making sense of the work in a new way that they didn't make sense of when he or she was alive. So let this be a beginning of that in a way. When Jonathan first asked me to come here and speak on the Lotus series, I have to confess I didn't really know what the Lotus series was. I'd never seen it. I was familiar with Rauschenberg, as perhaps many of you are, probably knew the exact same things as you did, things that I read, or having seen Rauschenberg over the years, being acquainted with Merce Cunningham or John Cage. Certainly, I was in touch with Rauschenberg in that sense as a touchstone. But I really hadn't thought about him in years. So this was a good lesson, and I think that I started out with the same basic knowledge that you all have of Rauschenberg. I think I have a little more knowledge now. A lot of what I don't really have a beachhead, is what I'm saying. As an art scholar or a Rauschenberg scholar, I'm going to come to you as a viewer and a poet and someone who was asked to interact with a new acquisition for Fred Jones Museum of Art. The Mary Lynn Cott's book actually begins with the Lotus series. She begins, the first chapter is on the Lotus series. And she talks about the Rocky Project. And it's interesting that she begins there, because I think at the time people didn't know what that was going to add up to, but I think it's added up to quite a bit in Rauschenberg's career. For once, I am actually happy that most people are sitting in the back, because this podium is so high and so far away that if you were sitting up here, I couldn't see you. So I think this is kind of a good equilibrium. I think what I'd like to do is start out with some poetry, because what I realized in working on this project was that in many ways my poetry had been in dialogue with Rauschenberg and his processes all along. And that was a discovery for me. I thought I was going to have to fine-tune things to try to do something in Rauschenberg's style, but having been influenced by the same coterie of artists that made all of this possible, that made my career possible, that made the careers of so many people possible, people like Cage and Cunningham, who I would call a kind of DIY, do-it-yourself artists. They broke down the barriers of art from on high, art as an institutional organization that proclaimed what art was from the museums on down. And they forced their way in, they broke down the boundaries. And in many ways I see that there is an institution of poetry that I've never felt quite like I had access to. And so I think in many ways those concerns, thinking about those, Rauschenberg in his early career, me now in mine, there's something to that. There's something in a way that I think that these concerns work together. So in picking up where Jonathan left off, I think that what we'll do is a textual assemblage and see if we can make some things happen. I have an animation for you, and I want to talk a bit about Rauschenberg and what I've discovered and see if it matches some of the things that you've been seeing. So I'm going to start off with the beginning of Analects. It begins with the character should, which means yes. Not the unsayable said, but the refusal to say the unsaid. The point where the things one needs to say are stronger than the need to say them. To be is our explanation. Near the window, the air is good, with a view of the street. Across the bar, wearing Marlboro gear, Liaomang, that is gangsters, pass out cigarettes like currency to their business associates. A drinking contest ensues. They raise every glass to a commanding "Ganbei," bottoms up. In a little while, to the delight of all at the table, one will show a day pack full of bundled $100 bills. I skim the mid-April inventory of construction disasters in a Shanghai daily as I wait for a painter of Mickey Mouse, best known for a single iconic design he repeats ad nauseum. His products are regarded as those of a wayward invalid who has no general authority. But this isn't the only reason to like him. He does not fear the monolith of representation. He does not go out of himself to meet me in conversation and works at painting as a laborer from the provinces totes a cane balance of bricks. He hasn't shown in New York at this point, but many of his designs have found their way onto streetwear in San Francisco. I am introduced to a woman named Tian Tian, who smiles out at me, tonguing her tooth as she does. There is no hope for failure in America, he tells me, though I cannot tell if he decides what this means, as I myself es Americano and have hoped for as much as anyone. How is it possible so many people can have nothing foreign to say, that nothing is foreign to her, yet she lives in isolation? America is success, he says. It's not entirely convincing to say I am a failure here on the bounding main. Nor can I recall the name Ed Ruscha in time to answer his thoughts on lineage or influence. Like dream in the American language, soul in Chinese is inescapable. So we're looking at the Lotus series. Most of you have seen this in person. I only just today saw it in person. So I was asked to react to a work that I had never seen, in a sense. And when I saw it today, I realized I had never really seen it. And I think it is extraordinary. The thing that touches me about the work is that by this time, this was the last work that Rauschenberg produced, and by this time he had had a stroke. And if you look at his signature, it's clear that it's not the same signature of Rauschenberg before the stroke. And yet he was still producing, yet he was still working with the use of assistants. But he took these photographs in the early 90s. These were all taken by him and his assistants in 1992, which was the very beginning of the Rocky project. I won't really go into so much of the background of that because I think that the gallery already does a good job. They've got some of the Rocky projects from the Soviet Union, and they've got the Lotus series, and they've got quite a nice catalog on it, so I don't think it's necessary to go into the background of that. But for those of you who haven't seen it and just may have come and not seen the exhibit yet, it's the Rauschenberg Overseas Cultural Exchange, which was focused primarily on developing countries, in which painting, sculpture, and video were produced using local artists. This began in China for Rauschenberg in 1992 when he went to a paper factory, said to be the world's oldest paper factory, to work with the laborers there and to produce work from this paper. And it coincided with something that he'd been thinking about for a long time, which is to go around to countries with mainly authoritarian governments and to use art as a fulcrum, to use bureaucracy, in fact, as a fulcrum to open things up, so that if he had the cooperation of the government, he would implicate them by design. And he got a lot of criticism for this. He got a lot of worry from friends who said that, this is going to be construed as you working with totalitarian governments, one of which was Pinochet in the 1980s. And he said that he said, I conceived of the tour as a giant creative piece on the hoof, supported by intrigue, deceptions, misunderstandings, and para-political maneuvers. It was an enormous undertaking, just logistically. He had to have all of his assistants working on this. This is an artist who produced over 6,000 works in his lifetime. And if you've ever mounted a tour for anything, you realize what kind of bureaucratic nightmare that would be, particularly going to China and Chile and the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, the kind of places it's not easy to go into as America's most high-profile experimentalist, experimental artist, or one of them. And so, to me, that's a sort of, it sort of bespeaks of his gregariousness and his adventure, his sense of adventure. Rauschenberg's, I have some notes here. I'm going to read from some of these because I think that I can state them better in the notation form. Rauschenberg was a global artist whose career coincides with the rise of globalism, and there's been a lot of academic hand-wringing about the politics involved in his export. It's an old argument of isolationists that we mostly see in places like Cuba, Burma, Myanmar, North Korea, etc., that embargoes intended to isolate authoritarian regimes have unintended effect of hurting local populations. But Rocky was actually the opposite of panda diplomacy. Rauschenberg was convinced that the most potent thing was to show controversial work in official venues, creating these works with the assistance of local artists and museum workers. And that's important too, because he went to these places and worked with museum workers who had no experience with international exhibitions. So for some of them, this was their very first exposure to a global international art world. And that paid benefits later on. In China, this exhibit, his Rocky exhibit, or the work that he produced there, the paper that he produced there, was exhibited in the National Museum of Art. It was called at the time it was called the China Art Gallery. Today it's called the National Art Museum. And this is the kind of place that displayed agitprop and government official paintings, these sorts of things. So he went in there. And there were 300,000 Chinese who attended that. Imagine that. Imagine 300,000 people going to an exhibit of one artist, right? Producing this kind of work. And there's not an artist that I know in China of that generation, which would have been the just pre-89 generation, just in the 80s when things were first opening up, Gaiga Kaifang, reform and opening, who wasn't influenced by that. And immediately after the artists saw that exhibit, they started producing work of their own. Nation avant-garde groups sprung up, and they started mounting their own exhibits. And in a way, what kickstarted a lot of the Chinese avant-garde visual arts was that exhibit, and it was sort of one of the best exports we could have given, because it was about the idea that you could just do it yourself, right? And so them imitating Rauschenberg was exactly in the spirit of the thing, you know. Now, that's come back to bite us because, of course, Chevy has now competition from Cherry, which is the exact same thing produced on assembly lines that were formerly General Motors. And that copying, is taken to the extreme. So there's also a cultural element there, perhaps, and an economic element. But if we look at it for the best of purposes, I think that we can see that it was a very good export. I've got a couple of, I'm going to turn this off now because we've cycled through those, and just take a look at some of, you're probably familiar with a lot of these, because these are of course the works that he's known for, right? The thing for me about any work of art is to avoid the cleverness of seeing what is not there, so I can focus on what is. It's actually very hard to do because we are trained with a critical impulse preventing us from what I call the long gaze, that is, purposeful looking. We're probably biologically hardwired to fill in the gaps and find stories, and flatter ourselves with our powers of comprehension. The advantage, I think, that we have with Rauschenberg is that it is already hard to read into his work because it's so surface. In this case, it's three-dimensional. But if we look at the Lotus series, or any of his print work, I find that surface is undeniable. when he's in two dimensions. This concentration on the surface, the resisting of absorption in the lyrical, the process, and the use of materials, the compositional technology of jazz, for instance, or the exploding of hackneyed language structures for poetry, is what we're looking at. Rauschenberg throws his gaze back at us and seems to see us looking in the process. And John Cage has a seminal early work on Rauschenberg called On Rauschenberg, where he said, there is at least the possibility of looking anywhere, not just where someone arranged you should. You are free to deal with your freedom just as the artist dealt with his, not in the same way, but nevertheless originally. And this is the philosophy of art that Rauschenberg and Johns and Lichtenstein and Cage and all of those came out of, I think, is that we as viewers are participants, because otherwise art simply becomes a commercial enterprise. Right? It's decorative and it sells. What I find in the literature is that there's a persistent question about Rauschenberg's work, and it has historically been about interpretation. That is, the critical anxiety involved in how to ascribe meaning to the surface, and how or why we choose certain images at the exclusion of others. What this points to is an economic trope of valuation, besides a certain kind of pointy-headedness as well. And for me, a work like Monogram, which we see here, is probably the best known of his combines. And the reason that it's lasted and keeps its power, I think, is the erotic surprise is intact, despite decades of debate about its significance. And at least initially it offended and temporarily defied the art commerce because his gallery refused it, didn't know what to do with it. Said it was too difficult to transport, said we're never going to be able to, what are we going to do with this work? You've got an Angora goat coming out of a painting through a tire. He found the goat in an office supply store in Manhattan on 6th Avenue. There's a famous story that you can read about it in the literature. But it's a great story, and he told it many times, and I encourage you to read it. Rauschenberg said, I really feel sorry for people who think things like soap dishes and mirrors or Coke bottles are ugly, because they're surrounded by things like that all day long, and it must make them really miserable. This, I think, is what the critic Robert Hughes meant by Rauschenberg's social profusion of signs. His breakthrough was to use what he already knew from the utility that surrounds us. He uses the idiom of ordinary life in the everyday. The most difficult person to surprise will generally be oneself. Acumen and self-knowledge bind our social lives, preparing us for what is expected. We are, if we have a modicum of sanity, socialized, necessarily so, but we are also profoundly interior. Our rapport with art, as with people, is likely to be refinement of existing habituations. One thing I find really wonderful about Rauschenberg is that where many artists and poets need to invent systematic limitations in order to produce work that will surprise and subvert the habitual act of self-editing, or just to deceive the speakeasy of life's official emotions, Rauschenberg was for yes. And when I read Rauschenberg's quote, I'm for yes, no excludes, I'm for inclusion, I thought of the beginning of Analects, because I began that book with yes, and it immediately touched me, that gesture, Of course, we should probably not leave out the possibility that this philosophy is also used every day to justify lazy thinking. Right? Rauschenberg said on another occasion, I wasn't involved in chance as much as I felt isolated. I wasn't interested in attaining a precious state of isolation. And I think this, combined with his gregarious personality, explains why he was so prolific. Rauschenberg told a wonderfully instructive anecdote, which maybe many of you have heard. but I'll just tell it in his own words. This was in the early 60s, an event at the Jewish Museum, and some of the New York High Art Society was there, and there was a woman that took umbrage at the previous work, Monogram with the goat. And he says, "To her, all my decisions seem absolutely arbitrary, as though I could just as well have selected anything at all, and therefore there was no meaning, and it made it ugly. So I told her, if I were to describe the way that she was dressed, it might sound very much like what she was saying. For instance, she had feathers on her head, and she had this enamel brooch with the picture of the Blue Boy in it, pinned to her breast. Around her neck, she had what I would call a mink, but what could also be described as the skin of a dead animal. Well, at first she was a little offended by this, I think, but then later she came back and said she was beginning to understand. Screwing things up is a virtue, Rauschenberg said, and he said this when he was 74 years old. Being right can stop all the momentum of a very interesting idea, close quote. This is not to say that the artist isn't in charge of his work. His assemblages are varied but not random, trusting spontaneity and intuition in his methods. He's able to return to themes. Change is the constant in Rauschenberg's work. He never lost the impulse of surprise, to mess with things, and I'm in awe of his generosity. There's also a lack of sentimentality, which I think is important. Tennyson's dew-fed lotus eaters, with their mild-eyed melancholy for escape, are the antithesis of the view Rauschenberg represents in the Lotus series. We don't have Elysian Fields, we have the Watts Towers and hubcap farms in America. Rauschenberg had a rich culture from Kansas City to Paris, the Black Mountain School with Joseph Albert's. His inheritance from Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades and Joseph Cornell's confections set behind glass. He grew up in East Texas, and I really think that a lot of the combines reflect a childhood of seeing things like bottle trees and hand-painted signs and outsider constructions around Port Arthur, Texas. Roadsiders and self-proclaimed prophets knocking out stuff in their backyard. Looking at the combines in this light, I think, is instructive because, at least with me having spent time in Alabama, Rauschenberg carried this aesthetic to New York. He picked up items on the street of Manhattan: junk, bedding, pipes, taxidermy, furniture, cardboard boxes, and in the way that Joseph Cornell would have searched the flea markets and curiosity shops for objects of exquisite perfection. To really see Rauschenberg, I think, if we look at Cornell's boxes of these antique memorabilia and exploded them and replaced them with the detritus of the American roadside, we would have Rauschenberg. He's not quite sui generis because he was trained at art school. He did go to the Kansas City Art Institute. He did go to Paris. But he so radically transformed that tradition of the ready-made as to make the search for precedents mostly irrelevant. It seems almost anything could be used as a combine, or in a combine, as we have here. Which is, of course, the source of so much of his material. Oh, I'm sorry. Rauschenberg said that he avoided images that were fixed. He said you could get that just from illustrations, and that was the source of much of his material. So, in thinking about Rauschenberg, then I'm thinking about art and the social, and so this next bit of talking will be about aspects of social art. This work, which is now at the Chicago Art Museum called Short Circuit, is a case in point, I think. He was invited by a gallery to choose some artists that would be displayed along with him. And he chose Ray Johnson and his wife Susan Weil, and he chose Jasper Johns. And the gallerist said, well, I don't know. I think maybe we just want you. I'm not sure that those folks measure up. I mean, after all, these are friends of yours, we really just want you. And so Rauschenberg said, okay. So he asked each of them to produce a work, and then he put them into the work and then put them behind doors that could be shut or open. And so what he did was, now the only two people who obliged it, we don't have Ray Johnson's contribution, which is a shame because I'm a big fan of Ray Johnson and his mail art, and I encourage you to look at him, but we have Jasper Johns, and Susan Weil is the painting in the top right. And you see the cabinet doors can shut, they can be disguised until the gallery opens, and then he's displayed his friends. And I think this is such a genuine act of generosity. It's so sincere and genuine, A lot of people kick down the doors, but Robert Rauschenberg kind of just charmed them down. I just think this is so charming. Rauschenberg had a populist interest in politics and public life. Art is social, he said. And he meant not just the function of art as its ends, but because, of course, his work was selling for, prices that the average Joe couldn't afford, right? But also as a process in the means of making art. What we are after is a social art, then. To engage all the pleasurable and sinister aspects of the social. But what would it mean to have a social art? To begin with, the most obvious case in the room, the fact that we are here and that a poet and a journalist has been asked to speak and to do a site-specific piece for Lotus Series is in itself a comment on art as social. The poet, maladjusted to the problems of the times, generally lacking decorum, qualifies as messing with the boundaries. The organizers of this series understand eclecticism at its best, I think. Confucianism provides another, more anodyne example. The Analects or textual assemblage. The Iliad of Homer is another, which began in the oral tradition and is presented in Stephen Mitchell's new revealing translation as a kind of wiki composition of the classical world. In fact, it may be difficult for us to see Rauschenberg now in a contemporary way. We're so used to textual and imagistic assemblage via random access and digital text and images, we enact this process every day online. But the problem with purity is purist. This is incidentally what drove artist Philip Guston away from abstraction to representation. I got sick and tired of all that purity, he said. I want to tell stories, he said. Eclecticism provides us with a solution to purity and the tendency toward high mannerism in art. Fascism at one extreme of the scale. When the pendulum swings to the other side, of the scale, the tradition is systematically reinvented and in a process of self-education and self-articulation. There is a redefinition, and seemingly random traditions or political or cultural combinations present themselves. So even as a poet has come of its construction, metaphorically, it is the role of the poet to set fire to the tradition. This includes the catalog of emotion. Make it new, Ezra Pound said. And the it was our tradition. Change seems to be what we most want as Americans, the democratic tendency toward integration, miscegenization. And paradoxically, what we most resist, note the politics of immigration. A social art would mean work that is protean, which comes from a concern of the self in greater numbers. Tocqueville said, the art of combination is essential for democracy, which makes Rauschenberg a very American artist. One of the most American in tendency, probably. And we see this in all of the greatest of American cultural products, from Whitman to our time, I think. Democracy is the irreconcilable ambiguity of formulation, in which the absence of hierarchy is suspect. For this reason, it offends mandarins and aristocrats alike. So I would like to present a piece that I prepared in reaction and response to and in dialogue with Rauschenberg and some of these ideas. I never found a one-to-one, I'm not an occasional poet. I would never be, I shouldn't say that, but I was going to say I would never be a good poet laureate, but offered the chance. But generally poet laureates are not asked to pen occasional poems. I mean, Robert Frost did it, of course, for Kennedy, and recently we saw an example in the inauguration of Obama, but generally they don't, so I think I'm okay. But nevertheless, the ideas are there, this idea of textual assemblage, and the way that Rauschenberg looked at China, I find a lot of compassion for her. He didn't spend very much time there. I have spent a lot of time there, but I still get an awful lot out of that, his enterprise. And so it's not a one-to-one correspondence, I think, is the message. Now, there's a lot of flash going on here, so if you're sensitive to flashes of light, I should just warn you that there's going to be a lot of flash. And so, fair warning. This takes 8 minutes, and so I just encourage you to just sort of let your hair down, relax, and sit into it. And if you've got a flask or something you want to pull out, you can, to each his own. I think this is full out here. No, that's full on. Blackout. There we go. I learned a lot about, first of all, with this piece, it's the only piece that I've ever been guaranteed that someone had to pay attention to every word I wrote. You can't cram too many words into a poem. I learned a lot with this piece, though, because you learn about materials when you work with language in any other medium. Because language doesn't naturally lend itself to anything other than voice recordings and audio and these sorts of things. But when you take language, just language as a material and put it in another medium, there are things you learn. And I learned a lot about what I could not put into that piece, that just would not work. You know, the small nouns, those worked. You know, add prepositions, you know, articles, things like that. So it reminded me to keep it, you know, in the best way. In the best way, it reminded me to keep things simple, you know. And so I can thank Bob Rauschenberg for that, and Fred Jones for inviting me to do that, because it was a great exercise for me. Thinking about poetry as a social art. Oh, sorry, wrong deck. Well, it's not coming on. Oh, there it is. Okay. I just want to look at two statements and then read some poetry. I'm going to read some from Analects and then read some of the new work that was inspired by this exercise and got me thinking about how I might interact with it. I'll just put these two statements up. The first statement is from Eliot at the very beginning of modernism with Prufrock, 1917. Till other voices wake us, and we drown. Right? This is very emblematic of the wasteland. Right? And the last one is George Oppin's rewrite of that line coming at the end of modernism. An end of amodernism, let's say, in poetry. An objectivist writing, till other voices wake us, or we drown. And I think that the difference between those two statements are significant and apply here. Eliot essentially asserting the individual authoritative voice of the autonomous ego. Oppin asserting the social and the collaborative. And I think that modernism made that transition. And it made that transition in a social sphere, right? Redefining the social. It had to, or else we would have stayed with Eliot's pessimism, I think. Right? And this is what I try to do in Analects. And it was very much about thinking of the Chinese antecedents to Confucianism and how the social was defined in China and how it's defined for me as an American. And so I'd like to read from that, in addition to earlier. I'll tell you, much the most interesting thing about me is that I'm in China, sitting there with a notebook stashed in the pocket of a blue army coat, smoking the mild woohoo cigarettes of number 1 factory, Anhui province. Kung says a person wishing to establish his own character also establishes the character of another. Kung instructs, go over the old so as to find out what is new, making the future the oldest place of all. Thinking of a use for himself, one evening, citizen Ah Chu comes to a facing text, the life of a young Chinese poet in his referent. Have you thought cheerfully, I alone discovered the cargo cult of Walt Whitman and saved him from obscurity in the library of Central High School? Following the same precepts, Ah Chu put lamp fires along the sides of Suzhou's misty bridges and waited for the moon to show. Bless you. I am a big fan of Chinese menus. And I'm a big fan of Chinese food. So I decided to write a poem that combined Chinese food and Chinese menus. And poetry. Menu. 3 kinds of twilight. 7 kinds of fried. The clidium of an earthworm. Cross-section slabs of Jurassic animite with plum sauce. Portion of Merlin on crenellated wall. 14 numbered circumlocutions. A coin mortised corner, Hunan style. Lassitude with wet noodle. Americans, he tells me in confidence, are known to be adventurous. No one can believe all the pigeons in New York. We would have eaten them. And then every meal has to have a fortune cookie. Well, at least on this side of the Pacific. To lose occupation but continue to make profession is slow death. I always wonder why you don't get evil fortune cookies. Wouldn't it be fun, you know? You will be followed home by a dark stranger. What? I demand my money back. I demand an explanation. Fei Shu was a hoarder. He had not lived an authentic life. At every turn, he did not choose to go into that life, the road that would authenticate the singular struggle to have chosen and remained what he might be, while being there in a place he already was. His floors sagged with newspapers and printed ephemera. It burned one night and consumed him. Perhaps the master answers, you are too hard on yourself. But I am neither small nor mean enough for that, Grasshopper replies. For myself, I did not want to end up as one who had spent their lives pursuing minutiae, a hoarder, least of all a collector of my lucky personal discoveries. But people I admired had done just that. American Silas Marners, socially penurious, who smelled of tannin and butter, their teeth coffee-stained, hair matted and oily, their scent musk, fingers smeared with Elmer's glue, copying source material and templates from bra catalogs and photo magazines into scrapbooks discovered in trunks, spare rooms, or beneath their deathbeds. America was once full of smelly amateurs and experts of indelible topics, tramping through the weeds to pastured cairns of obscure individuals. And yet everywhere professionals deny they have professions. Free as in given without wanting, not an improvisation. The last available act of defiance in American life, competence. The amateur dedication of a mendicant. The least thing done well, something preposterous and homemade. At the Yew Garden, the smell of scallions perfumes the square. In a crowd, photographers with chrysanthemums beneath the Longhua Pagoda. "What do they call you, boy?" asks a big Western confidence man, in the same tone of voice a man uses when he gives a Hopi kid $50 to throw his goat into the Grand Canyon instead of posing next to it for 5. We have every mooncake filling and festival food, but are uncertain whether our concerns of government are shallow. We are too curious to be understood. If, on the other hand, her activities expressed the government's ignorance of world opinion, she could easily expect prison. On National Day Eve, we mingle with the Minister of Petroleum. We are addressed by the Mayor of Shanghai. A cadre of deputies welcomes us. Zhu Rongji bids us soft landing with a toast. Dare to make decisions in the cultural exchange. Ganbei, Gaiga Kaifang, reform, opening. He cannot mean it, and he does all the same. These few preservations at the very edge of retention. That bulge in his pants is the rootless orb of lotus in a multitude of cant associations. The cheongsam fits the Chinese figure well, but they say it looks like a cheap suit on a Western female. In the ginkgo trees on Fuxing Road, a line of wash was whipping unsolved. A piece of monkey business with her scarf as she passed on her bicycle. This is a service being sung in the grotto beneath the truncated spires of St. Ignatius, with what obscenities lopped off by red guards. To see the sun-struck diocese, a molesting charity. What blue is to America, red is to China, a favorite color, a field of stars. Between word and recognition, a citizen must be willing to die for something believed without too much conscience. The most difficult circumstance is without doctrine. Color that is surrogate for heaven's pastoral of infinite blossom. With what cold, original voice comes an aboriginal silence in the giant bamboo. In a wilderness, I listen in a wilderness for a human memory of 1 billion, looking anxiously for something that, while it is expected and seems to be present, has gone. The way out was the way in. I turn east to feel the rain and hear the water song in the dripping grove. I walk on New Year's Day by a road of China local. The path leads to a scenic view behind the temple. Coals raked over space. Revenant stranger in an enormous night. "You are heavy-lidded," she said to me. "You have almost epicanthic folds." In the large, censorious room, our mutual admiration was facetious. I thought at first this was some deficiency in me and would not listen to the small voice that carped. In written Chinese, it is impossible to forget that that personality once meant the soul. In written Chinese, it is impossible to forget. It is quite possible, evidently, to forget. It's quite possible. I'm going to have to rewrite that one. In written Chinese, it is impossible to forget that personality once met not the soul, but the soul's mask. Each suspected it was our own ingenuousness that led us to admire so much the other's gifts. In your house there was once a first spider in the clean wood. But how far can we trust the sinuous rill? Are we in fact sentimental enough for the anti-sentimentalists? I'm going to leave you with a cautionary tale from Analects, and then I'm going to give you a very useful piece of advice. Let's start with a cautionary tale. Pronouns. How thoroughly we enjoyed that. How we went home and laughed ourselves unhinged until we were holding our stomachs and Emily had to come down and tell us to shut up before we woke the baby. For most of these creatures, you can be as a ghost dancer, walk invisibly across their path while you steal their souls. They invite our self-abnegation. They think it is about them, that you care more for them than you do for yourself. You flatter them with nothing more than your attention, and they believe it is because of who they appear to be. But they are seemingly unknown to themselves, when all the while you're watching their soul slip down the hem of their outfit and pool at their feet. You're thinking of the hollow thing left there talking to you, and how impossible it is that a thing such as this, which was made up to be an intelligent creature, has no antenna for the superior consciousness clearly in observation of it all. And so you tell them exactly who you are, without the explanation they seek. The only power you have, being, is more powerful. There is a self-satisfaction with the communal ground at a party, the connective coagulant. There must be something wrong with him who hasn't managed to engage them, or manages too directly to engage in recognition, what is taken for a candor. They don't understand how you can have so much, how you can know so much about what they do, and they know nothing of you, but the unembellished fact of having arrived before them, which they cannot perceive as true. They ask about your profession, which they believe, like a hometown or a choice of overcoat, will give the basic pattern of your character. They are in awe of trades. They deny constantly, though they trade on what they do, that they profess an occupation. And with no society, they are immobilized by its honest observation of them, which is not sincere. You withhold from them your soul's mask, but in withholding, how can they know if you defy them? It never occurs to them to ask, what do you do? How do I know you? He asked me to name one thing I love. I love the cricket's public sound, who have set their crafts toward our longing. I would meet with some provoking strangeness, or is it that I am to be merged, to disappear into these manners, in satisfaction and success, dodging in the most shameful way, my fulfillment, my fullness of meaning. You'll see why in a minute why mistaking dogging for dodging is jumping the gun. We are as things named and recognized, but wonder at what has become of us. There is only so much reading of the underground to be done. The making of a sentence is a way of remaking the mind, in hesitancy and occupancy, in residence, full. And this spirit that lyrics have not synthesized is a stranger's life, by all accounts, though it is nothing before the words can be found. To believe nothing is to believe in believing, independent of a beginning thought. There is life after language. In the dead end of significance, an awakening object, a thing loved for itself, the awareness scenery of others and ourselves, founded on the faith of a verb, to be, a genesis and separation. We are as we do not know, a tactical orient, who were not captive, the word into which is written the name. Here's the piece of advice. When a dog runs at you, whistle for him. Hearing an old set of retouched affections in his bafflement, he will think he knows you. I tried that once as a a kid, and it worked.